Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you may be listening to us from here on this big, beautiful planet we call Earth. This is Michael Cross here with another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions, where we like to ask the questions that you generally will not get either asked or answered in your mainstream corporate media. Anyway, before I begin, I would encourage people to click on my website if you're listening to this later on YouTube. Up there in the corner, just click there. You'll get to my official website. Also become a subscriber so you can keep up on, our future shows in case your schedule may be such that you can't listen to us live. Anyway, what I would like to do at this point is bring attention to the subject of biotechnology, and I'm going to discuss my most recent book and how that intersects. So anyway, I'm looking at an article this week, and it's talking about the development of chimera. Now, in case you're not familiar with what that means, it is the idea of mixing human and animal DNA, essentially, creating some sort of hybrid. And it can, of course, it's going to depend on how much human and how much animal DNA you mix. But, it's just that whole idea behind this that I want to discuss here. And that is, I understand the motivations for this. I understand that if you could in some way create organs and raise them within pigs that would be comparable to a human organ, and then you take that organ out when the pig is grown up, from the embryo stage up to adult, you take that organ and put it into a human body, and the human body would recognize it as its own, because part of it would be its own. And you wouldn't have to take immunosuppressants and so forth in order to stay alive. But I'm wondering exactly where the limit would be. Where would we stop at such technology? Now, there was a book written a few decades ago, and it was called Brave New World. And it sort of gave this idealistic, somewhat utopian image of what a world would be like if we completely engineered people that fit their environments. Now, some people may be taking issue with me here. They may be thinking, wait, that was a dystopian novel. It was one that talked about that was to warn us. No, it actually was not to warn us. It wasn't like 1984, which was to warn us against totalitarian rule and what that would be like on the human consciousness. Brave New World was written as kind of an introduction to a brave new world. And whereas it might have had some disturbing parts to it, it was not meant as this, oh, be careful, don't mess with DNA or else this is going to wind up being the future. Now, this reminds me of a reference that was made some time ago, actually. Now, it could be just, depending on whether you believe the book is authentic or not, it could be just a few hundred years old or a few thousand years old or even longer than that. And that is the Book of Jasher. And you're probably thinking, hey, what's this got to do with a science fiction book like Brave New World? Or what does it have to do with the issue of biotechnology? Well, the thing is that the Book of Jasher actually states, and you can look it up, just Google Book of Jasher, mixing animals, that it mentions the idea that people were taught how to mix the species, how to mix human, and later how to mix human and animal DNA. And you're probably thinking, wait. That sounds like a pretty advanced concept. Well, that list leaves us to wonder what the origins of that book was. And what did life look like back in the days of Noah? And how long ago was the book of Noah, was Noah around? Now, my book is not written in any way, shape, or form similar to Brave New World, except that it deals with the idea of what would happen to a society. Not so much if you designed it according to DNA, but if the people learned how to use DNA to design things for themselves. Okay? Major difference there. And where would people take it? So the idea would be that in this society that I present, and in a later broadcast, I'll deal with why I chose the setting the way I did. But ultimately, this is set in the Atlantean period, 12,000 or more years ago. And yes, it actually does mention Noah, but he's not a character. He does not have any part, really, to the novel. He's just someone that people sometimes turn on their equivalent to television and see and notice this crazy guy who's a disgraced scientist who starts ranting and raving about God destroying the world for its wickedness. And people take him as a joke, and he's sort of this comic relief sort of character that people mock constantly because of, well, one, that they think it's so atrocious, and B, because he gets away with things such as, because of his wealth, coming from a very rich corporate family, he's able to afford to travel the world and get all these animals, and is able to cut down massive amounts of forest, even though it may violate environmental laws of the time. And so essentially, my book is more of an exploration of what could really happen in the future. What is our future? And it starts out with the idea that there's a quote in the Bible, although this is not what you would call a religious book per se, although it does deal with it. There's a quote where Jesus says, and he will return when the days are like they were in Noah's day, which some people speculate that means that Noah's day was not just like ours, but far more advanced. And you're probably thinking, well, wait a minute, why don't we find anything? I'll get to that, why we might not find direct stuff. So anyway, the idea is that if humans were able to use the blueprint, which is DNA, and that's all it is a blueprint, it's protein molecules. You eat something, that's broken down into its constituents, and it's sent through the body, which cells are programmed to convert it to energy, to fat, to bone structure, to anything that goes into your body. Your body is basically a giant blueprint. And when you eat something that had a different blueprint, but still is compatible, then your body assimilates that and makes it its own. Now, we have only reached the infancy, the very earliest infancy of this technology when it comes to DNA and its application. But we are rapidly advancing. And this is actually quite fascinating, since the sciences that are advancing right now are nanotechnology, biotechnology, and robotics, which, of course, is associated with artificial intelligence. Who knows what we're heading for? But I mostly center on biotechnology. Now, if you had suddenly the ability to alter the human makeup, what would be the first thing you'd go for? What would be the very first thing that you would want to do? You would eradicate disease, wouldn't you? And if you really wanted to be good, you would make sure that your descendants were disease-free. Beyond that, so essentially you've got eugenics, but done at such a way that it's not like saying, well, you're superior, you're not, therefore you don't have kids or something like that. Of course, this does come in, but if you had the ability to fix everything at the embryonic stage in a way that it would get passed on generation to generation to generation to where you had perfect immunity and so forth, then this would be a major springboard in human evolution. Second, you'd probably want to engineer longevity. Now you look at the Bible, you got these things where these people that are described as living 7, 8, 900 years. And a lot of detractors from the Bible will say, see, that just proves the Bible's wrong. It's stupid. People could not possibly live that long. Nowadays, the most you have is maybe someone living to be about like 120, maximum. 121 maybe, but nothing beyond that. The thing is, we hear scientists all the time now saying that eventually we will cure aging. We will have the ability to live massive numbers of years, centuries. And we won't be just like shriveled up prunes when we're 300 years old. We'll still be what we are, you still be 20, 30 looking when you're 200 or 300 years old. And that's kind of funny because, there's a brief description of Noah that I put into my book. But the idea is, you see these coloring books that maybe if you went to Sunday school as a child, they show Noah as this kind of old guy, that white beard. He's like Santa Claus in a Bedouin outfit. First of all, why would Noah have come from the Middle East? I mean, he could have been from anywhere on the earth. That civilization that he would have been in could have been anywhere. We just assume that, the Bible, it's kind of like Middle Eastern, so therefore, every character looks Middle Eastern. Not the case. But the thing is, wouldn't he look, if someone was supposed to have lived 900 years, wouldn't he be kind of looking young during most of that time? Why do you depict an old man herding some animals onto a boat? When in reality, he probably would have been, looked like he was in college. If this is the kind of technology that you're going to develop, you don't want to make people stop aging when they look 65 or 70. You want to make it to where they stop aging at a prime level, maybe, 25 to 30. And so this would be something that would be expected, and I think this is what we will see in our society. We will see this eventually. Now, of course, will this be something that will be available to all people equally? I don't think so. And, of course, I put that in my book, that the elite bloodlines, I use the term bloodline, and it does get related to some of the conspiracy theories of today. But the elite bloodlines who have become who they are through selective breeding, eugenics, and so forth, they see themselves as superior, a breakaway, so to speak, civilization from the general population. Now, the thing is, there is speculation that this could happen just on its own in the future. If you have just normal, everyday, concentrated breeding amongst, here you have the elite who only marry amongst themselves. Here's the rest of the people who only marry and reproduce among themselves. I'm not sure I buy into that. And I think it would take longer than 1,000 years, which of course is what these articles I've read have speculated. But the idea could be that if you have technology to where you can alter the DNA of your, you fertilize an egg and sperm, and then you alter it immediately to where that child has a potential of living hundreds of years, that this could be something that maybe the elite would want to keep under wraps. Now, of course, they couldn't keep it completely under their own control, could they? I mean, that would result in all kinds of protests and maybe even revolution and the destruction of the elite. So maybe they could provide substitutes. Maybe they would keep the stuff that was really good, that was almost a guarantee of living to be 600 and 700 years old. Whereas regular people, they might have something that they have to pay for in order to maintain their youth over the centuries. But it wouldn't be permanent, something that would be passed on through their DNA to their children. So these are some of the things I play with. Now, speaking of that, have you ever thought, if we do get to that level, here's a very interesting speculation, if we ever did get to that level, what would that do to our society? What would it be like? Would it be a situation where we all still kind of marry people within our own age group? How would it affect what we would consider family, and who wouldn't be family? For instance, if I think you might have a situation in which once we get to that point where we're able to live hundreds of years and maintain our youth during that time period, and I am fully convinced we will reach this stage eventually, that you would see a situation in which culturally it would just change all the rules of the game. You might have someone who's 300 dating someone who's only 75. And you'd think, well, if they kind of look the same, but they would be so separated in their outlook on life. And what if you had a situation where someone's great-great-great-grandchild, they've reached 50 or 60, barely children, and they start dating them? I mean, these are kinds of things that would require a total change in our ethics, in our morality, perhaps. And speaking of the morality, what would happen to marriage? I mean, would it turn into a situation where you would get bored with the other person? But then again, you wouldn't have that situation where, you marry someone when they're, some young man's nice and handsome when he's 20, but maybe when he's 60, he's kind of fat and bald and no longer, so grand. And of course, you as a wife, you're kind of looking kind of the same, except maybe you're not bald. And, maybe instead the vitality would be kept because you wouldn't age. You'd be still the same. Or would it be something that if people lived so long, they would have a hard time maintaining monogamy? Maybe even their sexual orientation would be subject to change. I mean, over the years, over the centuries, people could be whatever they wanted to be for as long as they wanted to be and not have to worry about mortality catching up with them. Now, of course, you could still fall off a cliff when you're mountain climbing or something, or drown when you're out surfing, but you would still have this idea that you were no longer looking at life like, oh my gosh, I've only got a few years, I can't waste it this way or that way. Young women nowadays, they pretty much, when you get out of college and maybe you're 24, 25, you've got 15 years to have a family, to have babies. But instead, if that was eliminated where you could have children all the time, and that brings me to a very important point as well, what would happen to reproduction? You see, if you suddenly increase the human lifespan, that means population would go up rather rapidly if you maintained current birth rates. Even the low birth rates of Europe and the United States, which are below replacement, well, if everyone's living and they only die because of accidents or maybe, poor lifestyle, I mean, you still eat and wind up with a heart attack if you clog your veins up. Well, the thing is, what would happen to our freedom when it comes to reproduction? Well, first of all, your reproduction would have been taken out of your normal realm anyway. It wouldn't be the, romantic, maybe going out in a meadow and spreading out a blanket and voila, you just made your next son or daughter. It would instead be a situation in which if you're wanting to make sure that your children had all of these genetic advantages, everything would be done in the lab. All conception would be done in a situation where it be scientifically monitored. Now, why wouldn't that mean then that abilities to get pregnant would be curtailed by the state? Maybe you'd be issued a license. Maybe you would be told only certain people could reproduce, and then they could only reproduce when the number of people who have, when you reach a certain level of people who've died from other causes, and you're to replace them. And the state could easily do that. I mean, seriously, we have that technology now. You could require that a man and a woman, when they reach a certain age, let's say 18, or maybe younger, but let's just say 18. In my book, I list 16 as being the age of citizenship. But they go in at a young age, that you take sperm, you take egg cells, you freeze them, and then you sterilize your people. And then later, they can go back in when they get a license, and they can apply to have a child at that point. But there wouldn't be any accidents, because if you're sterilized, fully sterilized, when you would go ahead and supply the reproductive material, then you would have to rely on going to the fertility center and getting the everything taken care of, and then the woman would have the egg cell implanted into her uterus. Or beyond that, I mean, if we're at that stage, you might as well use an artificial womb. In other words, essentially, you would put your license in, and you'd pick your baby up 9 months later. You wouldn't even have to see any of the process. Okay, that would be all that would have to be done. So this is a stage, I think, that we will get to as well. In fact, it could even be easier than that. I interviewed a guy, a bioethicist, a few months ago, who stated that you could take stem cells from a woman's body, like her arm, and create egg cells. But it wouldn't be that much more difficult, really, from articles I've read, that later you could create sperm cells from her stem cells. In other words, a woman could get pregnant by herself. She could produce an egg cell and then produce sperm cell, and those could, fertilize and make a baby. She'd be both the mother and the father of that child. This is technology that's coming up. Okay, we're not talking, maybe a couple hundred years from now. No, this is technology that's coming up, that's being talked about in mainstream science. Again, it's going to change everything. The things you're going to see in the next 20 or 30 years are going to be phenomenal. The society I describe in my book, well, it's supposed to be one that you get the idea that this has been going on for maybe 1,200 years of science has led to this society that exists. But I still think that people listening to this right now may be able to see this actually take place. Because if you were able, for instance, with nanotechnology, to keep people alive longer, of course that doesn't affect their natural DNA, as I've been talking about, this kind of technology would, you could keep someone going. And maybe you could reverse it, kind of like that Benjamin Button's movie where, he goes from being an old man to a young man. You could do the same thing if someone lives to that point, and maybe they're 90 years old, and they're still the same person with their DNA. If you could fix that, you could reverse them back to when they were 20, 25 years old. But again, it would create such a major difference. And, some people, just like with the book Brave New World, which I've already pointed out, was not an inspiration for mine. But the thing is, some people would look at this kind of society as a dystopia, because you'd have the government control your very fertility. Some people would look at it as a utopia. So, it just depends on your outlook. Now, here's another factor for you, though. If we get to that point, because I'm just reminded of I watched this documentary a few years ago, and it was talking about space exploration and colonizing other planets. And it noted that it might be easier to create humans that would adapt to the environment of new worlds than it would be to terraform, meaning to take a planet like, for instance, Mars, and take hundreds of years to make it look like Earth, give it an atmosphere and so forth. Instead, you could design people that could survive in the limited atmosphere of Mars. And it noted that the only thing that would be a limit to what kind of human you could create would be the idea of what other animal species or even plant species are out there. Because in theory, if you have a computer system that can calculate everything out, you can create humans that are mixed with animals. You could have even some plant DNA thrown in there. Maybe they can produce their own food in sunlight. The thing is that you would be able not to get some messed up deformity if you mix, for instance, a horse and a human, but actually a fully functional centaur or minotaur or any number of maybe not so mythical creatures from antiquity. So the thing is that what you could ultimately see is creation of new species, because the definition of a species is a male and a female that can reproduce with one another. Now, if you mess up the DNA to such a degree that, let's say, you wanted to create some sort of aquatic species of human, well, you'd have to create a male and female. But when you do that so that they could have children, they're not going to be able to breed with humans anymore, because their DNA is going to be too different than the original human model that you used. So, therefore, you could see a situation where, just in our own solar system, you could have different species of people. And that gets us into the whole religious aspect. And it also gets us into the ethical. Because if you can mix human and animal DNA, well, what if you have something that's 20% lizard and 80% human? I call those, by the way, azogs in my book. The thing is that you could have those mythical creatures. I was reading an article about the whole CRISPR technology. You can look that up, DNA/CRISPR. And it was quite fascinating because it said that eventually, it's going to be quite easy to mix different. You could become an artist. And yes, a biological artist. You could create new flowers, new animals, new everything. You could create, a fluffy lizard or something like that using DNA. It's just that once our abilities to use computer systems to where we can calculate such things as respiratory system, vertebrae, and that sort of thing together, so that you would have something that would come out. Like if you try to create a centaur today, you'd have the problem of where would the lungs be located? Would it have two sets of lungs? And if so, how would the respiration take place? And, what about the back muscles and stuff? Well, that could be solved through being able to do the manipulations in such a way that everything kind of is in a balance. So that everything still works. It's just that, it's now a new mixed species. Now, of course, this is theory. But it's not one of those things just being talked about by, some Japanese animator somewhere. It's actually these are things being talked about by legitimate scientists today that could be possible when it comes to using our biotechnology. And this is something, this is the way I present in my book, the life in that era, is one that is pretty fantastic. I mean, it's wonderful. It's tremendous. Of course, you're seeing life from an outsider who's a member of the elite class, who's investigates. Is a detective thriller and is set 3 months before the Great Flood, and you find out some stuff going on that maybe could be the reason for the Great Flood in the first place. But the thing is that some of the more dystopian, aspects, of course, could be let's say you have these centaurs or whatever. What kind of human rights would they get? Also, couldn't you create people through synthetic DNA? Would it be a human if you create an egg cell not from a human being, not from a stem cell, but actually in the lab, and then fertilize it with a human sperm cell? What do you have then? Do you have a human being? What if our technology was such that you could just create artificial chromosomes with artificial DNA, or take DNA from, let's say, 100 different contributing people? Would that be a human? Or could it just be a new slave class that you could design? They wouldn't necessarily even have to have the intelligence of humans, just enough intelligence to do what you want them to do, whether it be sex workers or what I call maintenance imbeciles. You could have such a variety of legal and ethical issues that could come from this. Because essentially what you have is humans becoming gods. Yeah, I mean, I know Book of Jasher says the whole thing was to, mixing all the species was actually provoking God, and that's why he had to destroy the earth. Ultimately, as a way of erasing the pollution that had been created in the DNA code. But again, this is an old book, okay? This is not a science fiction book from 1960 or something like that. And the thing is, what kind of decadence would we have, too? Think about that. I mean, if a person, the good stuff is if you lost an arm or a leg, it could just be regrown. You could grow something in the lab and replace it with this kind of technology. No sweat. But then you get into the idea of how would people take care of themselves. You could do all kinds of stuff to yourself, and one can only imagine what the bondage community or something might come up with as things to do, but it wouldn't be permanently damaging. Anything you do, you can go into the doctor and have repaired immediately, and no scars or anything. Now, again, this would be giving humans godlike abilities. Now, if they're gods, what is the ramifications? Would you want to live in a society in which all of a sudden people were thinking of themselves as gods? I don't know. I mean, sure, it would be a breath of fresh air to realize that there's no more needs for deformity. People could be perfect. You could have a multitude of careers, a multitude of spouses, no definitions whatsoever for your limits when it comes to any sort of decadence you want to get into. And while that might sound good, I'm just wondering, I'm just wondering, is this what actually happened in our very distant past? Is this what actually was the last straw that meant that, gotta erase the creation and start over again? Hard to say. Again, it's, we don't have any way of knowing any more than we can actually prove there was a Noah or prove there was, whatever. But when you read through the Apocrypha and some of the accounts through other ancient writings, it seems that there was something going on in the past that wasn't just some Stone Age people, just messing around out in the fields or in herding goats. It was far from that, if we believe these descriptions. And if it was so, then, the earth's been destroyed at least once over this kind of thing. If you go by the Hindu ideals, then the world's been destroyed several times in the past. We don't know. We don't know what's been going on the earth. We just, dig up a few fossils here and there and think that we know everything. Where there's ample justified conclusions you can come to that things may not be as we have been taught all of these years. But again, this is one of those things. It's kind of nice when you can do science fiction because you can explore these kinds of things, and whether they're true or not, you can at least ask questions and also speculate as to where we're going. Because I personally do not think that the ethics we have today, the safeguards, those brakes that we put on, would exist in a world in which we finally learned how to conquer DNA. And that's just DNA. Oh my gosh, we could get into nanotech, and again, we could get into artificial intelligence. I mean, we're heading for a world that I would say that by 2100, it's going to make the progress that we have had, unless we destroy ourselves. That's always possible too. We're going to see a world that's not going to look anything like Star Trek or Star Wars or anything like that, because things are going to be so fundamentally changed that, it would be, you'd look back, in 2100 and look at these science fiction movies and think, they were just absolutely absurd because of what they left out. Anyway, okay, coming up on the break here, I would encourage you to, again, check out my website and subscribe if you're listening to this on YouTube. And I will catch you later on another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions.